Most people who die in wars did not create them. They did not design the foreign policy that created the conditions for the wars in the first place. But they are the ones who bleed. In every modern conflict, there's always a pattern. The people who decide are rarely the ones who fight, and the ones who fight are rarely the people who decide. And now, as the world enters another period of instability in the Middle East, with new conflicts, this time in Iran, there is rising tension all across the region. And we are left to discuss who caused it, who's escalating it. The countries involved justify it. Individuals and media houses take sides. But I want to step away from that, the usual framework. I want to ask a moral question, because I think it's very important. Who should bear responsibility for war? Welcome to Ozi Perspective. On this channel, I examine widely accepted global ideas and assumptions from a different angle. Because some of the most powerful ideas in our culture are accepted simply because they have been repeated for a long time. So here, the aim is to slow things down, think clearly, and question ideas that are rarely questioned properly. There is a pattern that repeats across countries and political systems. So the governments shape the conditions for war, and political leaders escalates, the media and everybody else weighs in. But when the war actually arrives, the demography that fills the ranks is disproportionately drawn from the lower economic classes. The poor often pays the price, the least privileged. If you look closely enough, you'll see it. It's an observable pattern. It's everywhere. It's clear for anybody to see. In fact, in most countries, the military recruitment data consistently shows stronger enlistment from working class communities. And you may ask why? Because of incentive, because the incentives are stronger. For some people, it's a very small minority, is about patriotism, yes. For others, it's a practical way of making a living. And for some people, it's both. But what we do not discuss is whether this dynamic creates a moral imbalance. So here's the principle I want to explore. If you advocate for war, whether you're a government official, you're a legislator, you're head of states, you're an individual, whoever it is, if you advocate for war, if you publicly push for escalation, should you be required to have direct personal exposure to its consequences? By this, I actually mean you must either be of fighting age and eligible to serve, or you must have immediate family members of fighting age who would serve. This idea rests on an old philosophical concept. Shared risk legitimizes authority. It's an old principle. In political theory, legitimacy often depends on reciprocity. If the citizens are expected to sacrifice, then the leadership must also be subject to sacrifice. In practice, however, modern systems often allow power to remain isolated from physical risk. And isolation often alters decision making. There's a very interesting concept called moral hazard, used by economists. So the idea is moral hazard occurs when someone is protected from consequences of risk and therefore behaves differently, often recklessly, than if they were fully exposed to the risk. So now if we apply that to war, if policymakers and influential people, presidents, powerful stakeholders are structurally protected from the frontline consequences, does that create a form of moral hazard in foreign policy? It's worth asking. Because war is not only a strategic event, it has human costs. Valuable human lives are lost during war. And if the cost is disproportionately borne by the lowest and the poorest than the people who actually take this decision, then that means there is an imbalance in that framework. And that imbalance may not always be intentional, but it does exist. Some might argue that modern leaders already bear responsibility in other ways. They face political backlash, electoral consequences, and sometimes historical judgment. And that may be true, but the point is, political cost is not the same as physical risk. And when you lose an election, it's not the same as losing your limb. Your reputation might be negative down the line in the future, but it's not the same as someone who's being buried after being a casualty of war. If we look back throughout history, one of the constraints on rulers was personal exposure to battle. I mean, in the old days, in the old times, leaders sometimes fight alongside their armies. And that proximity did not eliminate war totally, no. But it altered the psychology of command. But modern governance has managed to separate the strategic authority from physical vulnerability. They say that separation increases efficiency. But it may also increase emotional distance. If we look beyond government and decision makers, I think we should also look at individual responsibility. So if you're an individual who normalizes or rewards war rhetoric, you should also be accountable. But this is the moral challenge. If you advocate strongly for military escalation as an individual, a public debater, are you prepared for the advocacy to carry personal obligation? Are you prepared for your household to be first in line? And if not, why not? Some people would respond that societies need division of labor. Not everyone can fight. Not everyone should fight. We need experts. We need strategists. And that is reasonable. But that is not the same thing as structural immunity that currently exists in our societies. The principle here is not that every policymaker must carry a rifle. The principle is that no class of people in a society should be permanently shielded from the consequences of policies that they aggressively support. Because I believe this might change incentive. Because if every vote authorizing military action automatically requires lawmakers' families to be eligible for deployment, wouldn't that debate be done differently? If you're an individual and a public figure, and you're confronted with the fact that your household will be registered for the frontline service, I'm sure that would definitely shift your tone. I believe that, possibly. Because proximity alters perception. And psychologically, human beings often assess risk differently when there's personal stake involved. Because when choices are abstract, they are more analytical. But when it is personal, we process it more emotionally. When the threat includes your child, your calculation becomes more cautious. But that does not eliminate necessary action, but it would filter impulsive actions like the one we're having now. And I think another part to consider here is a fallout of war, where there's migration during war, when conflict destabilizes countries and regions. Again, who's displaced is always the poor. It's seldom billionaires and millionaires. It's often those without mobility capital. The poorest absorb both the initiation initiation and the aftermath of war. And that pattern reinforces inequality across generations. And here's the thing. Some countries claim that war is sometimes necessary for national survival and moral defense. If that is true, then sacrifice should also be nationally distributed in principle. But if sacrifice is consistently concentrated amongst the poorest in a society, then the war becomes not just a geopolitical act, but a class filtering act. And that should concern anyone who believes in fairness. Some conflicts may genuinely be defensive or unavoidable, yes. But the argument is about symmetry. If the decision to go to war is collective, the exposure to its consequences should not be structurally unequal. If the system is designed around symmetrical accountability, then those who shape and advocate and authorize war are automatically bound by eligibility. And so there should not be any insulation through peculiar status. Would that prevent all wars? No. But it's likely to reduce reckless ones. I believe so. Because when sacrifices is shared, the decision making becomes heavier. And maybe that heaviness is necessary. Maybe we need that additional heaviness to focus our minds. So now as new conflicts emerge and globally and the old ones intensify, I think we need to interrogate not just the strategy, but the structure and accountability of war. So finally, the moral question is, even if the implementation is complex, if you advocate for war as a government, a leader, a head of state, an influencer, or even as a voter, are you willing to share directly in its costs? If your answer is yes, then your position carries weight. But if your answer is no, then perhaps your position needs re-examination. As to who decides and authorizes war or who pays for it, if those categories do not overlap, then our system of distribution between sacrifices are uneven. And this ultimately erodes moral credibility. If you found this perspective useful, or if it made you reflect differently on wars and responsibility, then take a moment to engage with it. Either way, the discussion does not end here. This is Ozi Perspective. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.